Hello everybody, I'm Lady Sulavine and welcome to my realm of purpose. Today's video is a little bit different from the usual stuff I do here on the channel, but I had enough to talk about surrounding it that I decided it was worth a video. This isn't going to be about me hating all over BioWare or whatever decisions that have been made in Veilguard's development. I'm a big fan of the Dragon Age series. Who could have guessed? And I just want to get some thoughts out there that may add to the discussion in a constructive way. And I hope to make some people feel a little bit better in the process. And, you know, some people not so much, which is unavoidable, sadly. The purpose of this video is to add a little bit of positivity and optimism into the discussion, because I've seen a lot of negativity. And, well, we'll get into it. Recently we were given the confirmation that there will be 3 choices that carry over into Dragon Age the Veilguard. 1. Who the Inquisitor romanced, or didn't romance at all. 2. Did the Inquisitor disband the Inquisition or hand it over to the Chantry? And 3. Whether Inquisitor chose to redeem or stop Solus at all costs. This has caused a bit of a schism within the fandom, and I've seen a fair bunch of people outside throwing a lot of negativity at the game. Both with respectful criticism as well as your usual I'm gonna hate on this thing just because kind of crowd. I want to say before we continue that if you're unhappy with the fact that there are only 3 choices you get to select for a new world state in Veilguard, I get that, so am I. It's completely 100% valid. I have a few things to say on why I think that's a poor decision, but I also have a good few other things to say about why this isn't actually a deal breaker for me at all. Firstly, I generally don't like this decision. I believe it kind of shatters the illusion of your choices matter that these games have always had, even between games, but especially very specific choices that I will address in a little bit. I do, however, understand why this choice was made, and it doesn't bother me as much now as it did a few days ago when I first read about it. As for the reasoning for this choice, here's some insight from someone who actually worked on the game. Creative director John Epler says, "Our philosophy when it comes to integrating past player choices and world states is wherever possible we want to avoid contradicting what has happened before. We never want to invalidate your choices," he says. For Dragon Age the Veilguard, among many reasons why we moved to Northern Thedas, is it becomes a little bit more of a clean slate for us. There's not as many decisions that you've made up to this point that have an impact on what's happening in Northern Thedas, and we don't have to directly speak to things like who is the Divine, because again, that's happening in the south. There's never a sense of, oh, that decision doesn't exist, but maybe we don't touch on it in this particular title, he says. Much like Inquisition didn't touch on every decision from Origins. Much like DE2 didn't touch on every decision from Origins. It's kind of in that same vein of we're not going to contradict it, we just may not always reference it directly. We pulled forward the choices we felt we could do something interesting with in this game. The rest we took care not to invalidate, but I generally think we owe the big choices more than a line change or brief cameo. And more broadly, I made a conscious choice to focus more on reactivity within this game. Having your choices you make as Rook matter to Rook and Rook's story, but the choices you made before are still part of your Dragon Age. The impression this sets for me is this level of containment Veilguard will have within its own narrative. They have this story they want to tell, and they want Rook's story to matter to the players, not just as a piggyback off of previous stories. Things from previous games will be addressed, for example more insight into the dwarves, the ancient elves, and who knows what else lore-wise. The foundational lore and story is still there. It just seems that it's been curated to emphasise that this story we'll be getting in Veilguard. Let's first get into why I feel like this is a bad decision, because truth be told, I have a lot more hopeful and positive things to say about it, and I'd rather end the video on a positive note. Obviously, with the way BioWare's games operate is the emphasis on player choice, both contained within individual games as well as throughout a series. We the fans adore and crave the catharsis that comes from seeing the consequences of choices like who ended up ruling Ferelden or Orlais, and who didn't. Or whether or not Morrigan had a child and where that arc took her. And a bunch of other things I failed to mention, purely for the sake of brevity. After all the choices we made in previous games, well yes, they occurred between 8 and 20 years in the lore, and they took place in southern Thedas as opposed to the north where we've never been. It just feels so sad. Knowing that all of my choices will be cut off and where those stories were possibly going. At least for now. For example, I'm currently playing through Inquisition? For example, I'm currently playing through Inquisition, and it's kind of odd to play knowing that nothing important that my Inquisitor did actually mattered, other than what has already been shown. Especially since Inquisitor is going to be in the next game, I feel like it should be a lot more important than it's coming across as right now. On top of that, I can't help but think of the choices that should matter in the next game. For example, the consequence of who drank from the Well of Sorrows, whether or not Morrigan had a child, as well as the fate of 3 of the Inquisitor's romances, among many other things. And you know what, let's just actually address why those are important. The Inquisitor or Morrigan drank from the Well of Sorrows, binding them to the will of Mythal, and possibly Solus if you're invested in certain theories, but that's not confirmed, so whatever with that. But both Inquisitor and Morrigan will be in the next game, and it feels very relevant that they would still have the voices of the Well speaking to them, regardless of what happened to Flemethal, because they did still hear the voices in Trespasser. These are the voices of the ancient elves. That should be important. Whether it be a conclusion to the Origins choice of having an old god baby, or simply the character development of Morrigan as a mother, since she is in this game, I think it should matter whether or not Kieran exists, even if he's now an adult. Is she going to act the same regardless of whether or not she was a mother who loved her son and that practically changed her arc? Because that one hits personally for me, honestly. That character arc resonated with me on a personal level, and to not address it kind of hurts, and I don't know how else to put that. So it's really disappointing knowing that's not a choice. As for the 3 romances, if we get to select the romance that the Inquisitor chose, it stands to reason that it will be brought up and explored in the new game, since it's one of 3 choices that are carrying over as a world state. This means that the choice branches off into other significant choices from the previous games, since 3 of those romances, excluding Solus, have different fates for the characters involved. Therefore, a different ending for the Inquisitor. Ironbill could have turned on the Inquisitor and died in the Trespasser DLC, as a result of the quest Demands of the Qun, in which Inquisitor must choose between saving the Bull's Chargers or saving the Dreadnought and allying with the Qun. Blackwall could be dead if the Inquisitor chose to leave him to his fate during his personal quests, among other possible fates. Cassandra could be the Sovereign Divine, and while we're in the north with the Black Divine, I feel like it should still be relevant, since one of the 3 Divine candidates is the lover of an Inquisitor. You're really gonna tell me that if Inquisitor is in this game, that's not gonna get brought up? Really? That should be relevant on some level, even if it is just a one-off line. I would rather have the one-off lines in a simple cameo than them not being there, is the way I feel about it. These are choices that become important and integral to the story because they connect to the Inquisitor and Morrigan, who is important to this new story, and it should be at least mentioned in the next game, otherwise it's as if these choices never happened, which I know Epler's tried to address in saying, we've got it, basically, but I still have my concerns, knowing as little as I know currently. In saying all that, I do have some positives about the 3 choices decision. This is a story that continues on pretty much from Inquisition, and Trespasser specifically, while it be 8 to 10 years after the fact. It's not really about everything you did before, it's about the Veilguard story, as much as it'll be sad to discard so much from previous playthroughs. What Veilguard seems to be going to focus on is Rook's story, as Epler says, about Solus, and our new companions, the 6 factions, the north of Phaedus, and all the insane things we didn't fully get to explore in previous games because we were in the south. It's a new story with so much to offer, and I think it's at least worth considering we have so much to look forward to. The way I see it is we're going to go into depth with the Inquisitor's story, with Varric, with the ultimate choices made by our Inquisitors. Did they fall in love, and did that work out for them? Did they give up their power or carry on with the Chantry? And most importantly, I feel, is whether or not they chose to save Solus, and what that will mean for Rook's story, for Veilguard's story, and, obviously, Solus's story, as Fen'Harel, a very integral character within the lore. It's going to be in-depth and focused, is what I'm saying. they know what they're doing. The writers have not failed us before to tell an excellent story, especially with their main stories. Like, this is why we're so invested in the next game. I do trust them on that, is what I'm trying to get across. I still feel like there could be more choices added. I also think loading a bunch of questions at the start or setup stage of a game would be quite overwhelming for new players. And honestly, as well as established fans who just want to get torn into the game. What they did was pick 3 choices that will centre us in what happened before and why it matters now. In addition to this, I want to say that if they had added several other choices at the start of the game, such as Kieran or the Well of Sorrows, you would know with certainty that that's going to come up later in this game. It would spoil things that you don't know are going to have payoffs yet. Either you add every choice that ever happened before, or you add a very select few that don't spoil the rest of the game, is what I'm thinking. A theory that me and some people in the Discord have come to is that we may be able to talk to Varric or even the Inquisitor or other characters about previous events, and through dialogue choices we may be able to allude to previous events and choices, and flesh that out more as we go. I'm hopeful that there's something that they're not telling us, because they don't want to spoil the story. On top of all that, there may be DLC that addresses previous games and choices. Or the devs are deliberately misdirecting us about the choices in this game. There's one quote that I found that makes me very suspicious on the only 3 choices thing. Scatter the Worlds asked, "If you're inclined to answer, did Kieran grow up to be a mage like his mama?" Epler responded, "Tell you what, ask me in 3 months and I will give you an answer." Part of it is that I feel like Kieran is Dave's character, but also I think I can give you a more interesting answer then. The last thing I want to talk about is my general thoughts and feelings about the choices in the series as a whole, and it's something that I feel very strongly about. In the Dragon Age series, there are many choices you can make, whether it be main quests, personal quests, side quests, dialogue choices. They all add to the experience, and it's always rewarding to see the consequence, whether within the same game or something that carries over to the next game, or if it didn't matter at all within the narrative. Hawke's entire story was pretty much insignificant. When I tried to think of examples beyond freeing Corypheus in the Legacy DLC, I ended up asking myself, did anything they do matter to the narrative at all? Beyond a one-off line from Varric or Hawke themselves, Dragon Age 2 was of little consequence, for the most part. It was a story of a decade-long tragedy, of trying your best to make a difference and it all to mean nothing in the end. You couldn't save the people of Kirkwall, you couldn't save your family, you couldn't stop the rebellion from happening, and you couldn't stop Anders. Hawke's choices didn't matter, but Hawke's story still mattered. While I love quests like taking down the Archdemon, or choosing between the mages and Templars, or choosing who sits on a throne, or taking down Corypheus and his dragon, I adore the main stories and how that makes me consider that this will have ramifications for the world, for the fate of Thedas, and the characters that I grew to love. But the quests that really stick with me are actually the little ones, or insignificant ones in terms of the grand narrative as a whole. The ones that make me remember my character in the world are putting flowers on the grave of some man's wife, giving money to the elves in the alienage, helping Dorian find absolution with his father, telling Compassion that it wasn't its fault that it couldn't save Cole. For me, this is the beating heart of Dragon Age. The choices that went unwritten. The ones that made me feel like I mattered in this world. A year or so ago I was walking home from shopping late at night and one of my bags broke. I had to call and wait for someone to come and pick me up, but it would take a while and it was dark out, and for a young woman this can be pretty unsettling, especially in the area that I live in. A random woman came along and asked if I was okay. She gave me a spare bag she had and she waited with me until my lift arrived. I don't remember her name. I never saw her again, but I remember her, and I remember that random act of kindness. It mattered, even if it wasn't something particularly significant in my life. Your choices matter, even if they don't have payoffs or conclusions or consequence. I recently played in Hush Whispers, and I can't help but think of that as well. How a year of history of suffering was erased in an hour. That story still happened, you experienced it, and you and your Inquisitor are the only ones to remember it, however insignificant it became the moment it was undone. The point I'm trying to get across is there is meaning to the choices of previous games, even if they don't carry over into the next game. You still went through that, you experienced a story you loved, characters you loved, and it mattered. And in the next game, you're getting to go through that all over again.
Take moments of happiness where you find them. The world will take the rest.